Since we're coming to the end of the summit, would not be complete without an exam, since I'm a professor. And so the exam, while you're listening to the discussion, is for each one of you on a sheet of paper to make one concrete proposal that the group can work on for next year in terms of issue around, for instance, what is a partnership that might be suggested that would benefit the think tank community in India? What is a policy issue that we've discussed where there might be collaboration in working on that issue? Or in terms of how can we, which we really did not discuss, in terms of the role of women in think tanks. The reality is, which we did not discuss, is that women in think tanks are relegated to what is comparable to social work and nursing, which are the helping careers. And so in think tanks across the globe, women are found in great numbers in communications and in fundraising, but not in the executive, upper-level executive positions. There is, to a certain degree, women represented in research, directors of research, but not in the upper echelons of think tanks. The question is, why is that so, and how can it be addressed? More broadly is the question of diversity and its connection, which is the important part in terms of think tanks, to innovation in terms of policy proposals, et cetera, and how that might be addressed. As a few possible examples of what might focus on. So if you could put at the top of your paper, not your name, you can put your name if you like, but if you are just your country, so that we can separate them by country, and we will essentially then provide, collect those and then provide them to everyone once we have them collected, and hopefully serve as a catalyst for that. One of the most rewarding things for me in Latin America, in Uruguay, met with a group of the think tanks in Uruguay. They, after that meeting, coalesced and are now meeting on a regular basis and have launched a major collaboration on science and technology policy with the government of Uruguay. So that it is possible, simple ideas going forward in the partnership. It could also be around issues such as crowdsourcing that was suggested by Samir yesterday. Can we explore that, the feasibility for think tanks in terms of alternative funding sources? So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Harsh in terms of chairing this.
And I thought, I think in particular, and you know, many of you would, I hope, engage with this part of this of the debate about research and how important research is, and empirical research in particular. And I think one of the unfortunate trends that at least I am witnessing is that the younger generation increasingly is getting this idea that you can get away without solid research. And I think that is a problem. And the more we tell, you know, the more we articulate that communication is all that matters, I think that then it becomes a problem. And I think therefore we have to be very careful in terms of how we are looking at this question of research and its communication, especially to the younger cohort who's coming into the system and thinking that only, you know, tweeting, only being on Twitter is the most important thing, that you have ideas that you can just tweet around 24/7, and that's how you get things done. And I find that increasingly happening in the system, where at least in India we are in, you know, the research component is going down. And so we have to be very careful in terms of how we engage with this subject, and I hope to hear from you, from more of you later during the discussion. Now let me go to Brigadier Sehgal for his comments from the
The ORF staff will come around and collect your suggestions, so we'll be starting to do that in a few minutes.
Thank you, Harsh. I'm grateful to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm from Delhi Policy Group. We are a small boutique think tank which straddles security, foreign policy, and geo-economic space simultaneously. What we have tried to do is to fuse together all these three elements into our discourses. So the fundamental question that I have for everybody is, who is a think tanker is, and who's working in a think tank is, what is your research all about? Who are you addressing it to? And what is the purpose of that research? I ask this question purely because the issue is that by and large, we, like already been brought out, we're using secondary sources essentially. And we are using secondary sources and also from a particular perspective, from the Western perspective, largely speaking. There is not enough effort being made, even in looking at secondary sources, to look at regional sources and try to incorporate those thinking. We have a second issue is the problem of language. For our two principal challenges, we have a language constraint. People don't know Urdu, they don't know the regional press, they don't know. And second is the Mandarin. There is not enough build-up. And I will tell you something, we looked at this issue and we have started bringing out a thing called a China Monitor. Every month we go through religiously hordes and hordes of Chinese literature in foreign policy, security policy, party activities, their military aspects, and bring out this China Monitor, a 17, 18-page document which encapsulates what happened in that month. Over a year, we get a very interesting trend lines of what is happening inside. So this is an important issue that I just thought I'll flag. The second issue is we are focusing on what we call track 2 and track 1.5 engagements. Now, India is at a unique place. We have the opportunity of interacting with practically every part of the globe. And we interact with West Asia, we interact with Southeast Asia, we interact with East Asia, we interact with the United States, we interact with Europe, and we interact with Russia. A lot of other people do not have that perspective. Now, the perspective gained from these are often found very useful in shaping our options for the policymakers. I'll give you an example. We just now concluded a one-year program with CSIS where we looked at through series of video conferences. We ran close to about 8 video conferences and formulated it into a document called India-US Maritime Cooperation Doctrine. So now then we had a meeting in DC and we released the report. But the most interesting part of this was that every video conference was attended by people from the MEA and the Ministry of Defense. Serving people were present in those discourses. So they were not off-the-cuff discourses. The policymaker as well as the so-called researchers were fused together in those discourses. Track 1.5. Now, track 1.5 is an ongoing process. Like we have the India-Japan Indo-Pacific Forum. We have run about 6 iterations of that. Now, we have over a period of time formalized issues and subjects that we want to discuss or we want to go forward. We have a fairly good understanding of Japanese position on mostly all issues are concerning security and foreign policy. We have a reasonably good understanding. We have a reasonably good understanding of, personally run a track 2 dialogue with the Pakistanis for last 10 years, 11 years now, on CBMs as well as nuclear CBMs. Fairly good understanding, which we feed it to our government. I openly say, I mean, we tell this to the Pakistanis, we feed it to our system. So we have an understanding of what the perception of the other parties are. So what I am talking about is the relevance of the think tanks. If you want to occupy a policy space, you have to work towards being relevant to the policymakers. And policymakers are looking for ideas and options. You can't tell them to do this or that, but you can always feed into him and ideas and options. And today I find that there is a large amount of interest which is being particularly, not so in the MEA for my Indian colleagues, but in the National Security Council. National Security Council Secretariat today we engage with them on a regular basis, including doing joint studies with them. So, so there is this whole issue of being, of relevance, which often is looked upon as something which is not there, but it is coming up. There is a growing government reach towards the think tanks. It is basically, like the gentleman before me was saying, is the quality of product and what you are offering to him. There are a couple of issues which I want to highlight, or the constraints. One is a lot of our think tanks, I've been in this business after retirement for 20 years, sirs. And even raised think tanks. So I'm just sharing my perspectives. There is a lack of policy experience. So what is happening is, a lot of outputs are largely academic in nature. They do not take into account the obtaining realities of the situation. And here I would like to highlight a couple of aspects. For example, I feel the think tanks have to realign themselves, their research, to the changing narrative of the global discourse, wherein the globalization and multilateralism have lost ground to native populist and protectionist tendencies. Now the question is, how do you locate your country in that scenario? What is it? What are your options? What is the strategic environment in which you want to relocate yourself, and what are the options that you want to generate? The second is, there is this whole propensity to leverage power in pursuit of national interests. We saw that happening recently in Iraq. The question is, what are challenges do they provide? We are seeing South China Sea what is happening. So until and unless we come up with ideas and options on that, and those ideas and options, sirs, will only come about if you do a detailed assessment. And what I call, I started the Office of Net Assessment in India, and we have to look at a three-tier strategy. What are the trend lines? You have to start looking at trend lines. Think tanks, to be relevant, have to look at trends. What are the current trends? Which directions are they taking? Number two are, what are the kind of scenarios that emerge out of these trend lines? There's a methodology attached to that. And the third is, what are the strategies? What are the defining strategies? What are the core strategies? So until unless, once you give that such reasoned analysis to your policymakers, they will listen to you. They will listen to you. The third issue is that technology. We all talk about 5G, we talk about 4th Industrial Revolution, Internet of Things, etc., etc. But we have a very little idea what it means, basically speaking. How many of us are aware of the fact that the Chinese 5G phone, which has been launched by Huawei, has 30 international players who are involved in that research. There are 30 international players who have contributed in building that phone. And the chip have got 5 people. Now the question is, when we are looking at the fact that Huawei is a technological challenge, the question that comes about from the research point of view is, who controls the IPRs? Where are the IPRs are being controlled? And if we can answer that question where the IPRs are being controlled, we will get somewhere. Otherwise, simply saying, parroting the fact is that somebody else is saying that your entire command and control system, your entire networks can be taken over by the Chinese, this thing is wrong. Yes, there are vulnerabilities. Of course, there are vulnerabilities. But the question is, you have to define your vulnerabilities. And if you are talking in the policy space with the policymakers, you should be able to define those. So we need to be concerned about our technology. Think tanks are not spending enough work and effort on technology, understanding the role of the technology, what role the technology is going to play. The next element is that we have found very useful is strategic gaming exercises. I conduct strategic gaming exercise both within the system and outside the system, and we find them very useful. We find them very useful in the sense that simulation, even based not only on quantitative, even on qualitative data, based on using the net assessment or orient and similar gaming techniques, you can come up with some very, very interesting formulations. And once you come to those interesting formulations and you come up with some core strategies and provide the people with strategic options, you will realize that it's a win-win situation for the think tank. So in funding, of course, I'm not coming to it, but funding is an issue which everybody has, so this is something which is a perennial issue. But the point is that we have to have a focused research orientation of a think tank. Think tank must understand in clear terms and not vague statements like I'll look at the national security space, I'll look at the foreign policy space, etc., with having 5 people in the think tank. I mean, there's a huge, in the mission statements are huge, but the effectiveness of the mission statements is very, very limited. So I think it is important for the think tanks to relook at themselves rather than always start looking outwards. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. And I think so I open this for you all now to look at yourself, to come up with questions that perhaps you think are important. And this is not this is a conversation, so the questions need not be addressed to the panelists, but you are free to interject because this is ultimately about the strategies and operational challenges facing think tanks. Yes, sir.
Can I speak? Yeah. Actually, I want to talk about the issue of research and the issue of organizations that self-define as think tanks. I mean, to my understanding, which is probably limited, you have NGOs which do research, you have research institutes which are more academically oriented, and you have the category of think tanks. And with the changing patterns of funding now, with a focus on action, outcomes, outputs, many academically oriented research institutions like mine, where I come from, we've had to move to a more action-oriented kind of understanding of the kind of research we do. So, what is the kind of the different paradigms of research that are obtaining has now changed. And when it comes to think tanks, I presume that the emphasis is on policy and all that. And yet, we have now a situation where, say, the Indian Council of Social Science Research, to which my institute is affiliated, has a program which it has started in the last 2 years called IMPRESS, which is research, it's a long acronym, but it's impactful policy research. So, our research agenda is being kind of transformed, if we want to survive, to go into a slightly more think tank mode direction. And I don't know whether we are ready to do it, and I don't know if half of us are even aware that we are going in that direction. So I think there's a churn happening, and I think it's linked to the nature of research with cyberspace. I mean, now I have so many students, they don't want to go out and do field work. They don't want to do hard empirical data. They think the internet is a field work space, and in many ways it is, because it does give you certain kinds of data which are influencing, trends, and which are creating situations which are worthy of research. But is that what we want? So there's a whole explosion of internet-mediated research, and they'll go to, they'll use WhatsApp groups, they'll use blogs. Now, how reliable is that, and how different and how authentic is that? I mean, it is authentic, but compare it with, going out into the field scenario, going into the communities, talking to people in a face-to-face communication. So I think this whole idea of research is getting transformed. The other thing I want to know is, who are the people who are going to come to think tanks for employment? These are people, say, in the Indian context, who will probably be coming from universities where they have an MPhil or a PhD. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know how to put it, but there is a huge ideological positioning that is happening in universities that is coming down in research. And in many cases, what happens is the conclusion of the research is preordained before you've actually begun the research. So you want to work on Dalit identity. You want to work at Dalit participation in the workforce or stigmatization of the Dalit community. You already know. You're already having a perspective. So a lot of research that's coming out now from universities is very ideologically driven, and that needs to be negotiated. And the last point I want to make is, I think we need to do a genealogy of think tanks now, because it's an entity that, in connection with other institutions and organizations that do research and policy-oriented research. Thank you.
Jim, I think you should intervene here.
Well, I mean,
This question of genealogy.
So, I mean, it's connected to the rankings, because there are those who would like a very narrow definition of think tanks. And when I probe for, what they mean by that, it generally means that they would like institutions that are ranked higher than them, who may not fit their definition of a think tank, to be excluded. Which is, problematic in itself. But the reality is that, all of this, in terms of research, in terms of my experience, that it is shifting. And even I've been asked by major universities to, as they are reevaluating track and tenure, that is publications the publish or perish, is that the only thing upon which tenure should be based? So that all of this is in flux. The lines, I think, further in terms of, strict lines between institutions, I resist that. I do clearly have a definition for think tanks, which are public policy, research, analysis. Some may have trouble with engagement, but I think if you're not engaging, policymakers, the public, et cetera, it is, you're not doing your job, and you're not effective as an institution. Having ideas and not having them aggressively by those who might use them and, more importantly, benefit from them is an important obligation that think tanks have. I don't know if that answers your question, but clearly universities and think tanks, all of this is under question. All of it, the lines are becoming more and more blurred. And it's not just, if you look at other fields, if you look at those that were producing entertainment, they're out of, or producing news, they're now producing programs. Those who were producing entertainment, in terms of, in a strict sense of movies, are now having a much broader view of that. So it's not just a phenomenon that's taking place within the think tank community. It is in virtually every area where lines that were strict in terms of organizational definition are being blurred. And that's a part of the transformation that's generally taking place.
No, I just...
For some extent, My question is a follow-up what you just said. Ugo Tramballi, ISPI of Milano, Italy. Pradeep, you said just before freedom of speech, and in the meeting before, someone was talking about to be watchdogs, to check the accountabilities. This is a wording of journalism. I mean, this is what they used to define the journalism. I'm moved because I was journalist for 40 years, and as an officer of the army, I'm still a journalist despite I retired. Could you define the difference or the distance between a think tank and a journalism, a good journalism at least? It seems to me there's going to be the line is going to be more and more gray. Because, I mean, what I used to do 10 years ago as a journalist before the big crisis of the printed press is, I mean, having time to find out my news, to check to make a double check of the sources, to have time to speak with the people, to study the files. It's something I do not today with the ISPI, with my think tank. It's something I read, reading Brookings, Carnegie's, and the other big think tanks, American think tanks. Is there a chance that the journalists could be, I mean, the journalists that used to be, now, I mean, maybe in the United States, the crisis is not so deep like in Italy and other part of Europe, but, I mean, in antagonism with the web that required the fast news, hard news, and then today they say it's gray, and tomorrow they say sorry, it's not gray, it's red. The slow journalism, the slow news. I mean, is there the possibility to increase the relation between journalism, that kind of journalism, and the think tanks' work?
This is about a point that I know made its appearance yesterday about whether journals are relevant. Should we now adopt brevity? Go out with WhatsApp and Twitter and whatever else which is there. It's also reinforced today by Neelam Dev. The point is, I think we cannot compromise on the rigors of research by adopting brevity. It may meet the need of the day, but for future references, I think it is inescapable for us to continue with maintaining our journals, our complete track records, and whatever else we have. Otherwise, we'll be going the wrong way. After 6 months or 7 months, if you want to find something where it is, what is the basis for such a research paper, you will not have it. So you cannot go altogether and say we'll abandon journals and periodicals and op-eds and whatever. So I think we'll be adopting a very different procedure if we have to, just because we have to flow with the tide. I think we need to review these options for think tanks.
Let me just say one thing that I found helps. Given all the tensions we are navigating, this concept of post-truth, communicating on Twitter, the speed at which information needs to come out, we found it really helpful to always follow a path of quantification and being data-based. Because I think you need to anchor your claims and what you're saying, not just in opinion or ideas, but in things that can have a center of gravity. And in many ways, it's not just data. A lot of things can be quantified. And at least then there's a point of departure. And that has really helped us shape and change and engage with important issues in Sri Lanka, because we are quantifying things that other people aren't. And the biggest, and a recommendation I have for that for Asian think tanks is to work together to open out more data. Governments have enormous amount of data that they either share with privileged few so that the government is not criticized, or just waste actually by keeping it hidden. But opening up data, following paths of quantification, data-based engagement, I think can be very powerful, and that can still be communicated in ways, in diverse ways, from tweets to journal articles, and we do all of them at the same time. That's how we overcome that challenge. We don't limit ourselves to one form of communication. We always have the 50-pager, the 10-pager, and the 3-pager, and the tweet to go with it, and people engage in different places.
What we'll do is we'll have the panelists respond to this first set of comments, and then we'll come back again to the audience. But one thing which you mentioned post-truth, and it was very interesting because in Scandinavia now, they have started school-level courses, basically teaching students how do you assess information, sources of information. And I think this is going to be extremely relevant for our generation and this generation that is coming, because the sourcing is so crucial. And I think half of the time, because of this ideological polarization, we tend to believe our version of the story and completely disregard the other side. So that means that I think unless we have the ability to assess various sources, it becomes very difficult. And I think this is a great start, and perhaps we need to think about it doing even here in India or in other schools, perhaps at a school level, where students are initiated into a certain kind of a mode of inquiry, which is not available in other quarters. But I'll now start with Pradeep.
Thank you. This is going to be a little disjointed in the sense because there are several remarks. First is, evidence-based policy making is extremely critical, and that is where you can contribute as a think tank. This is what we've been doing, and therefore, it builds up your credibility as well, which is also important. Now, an area which I think is part of the future strategy, which is important for think tanks to think about, are the macro-micro impacts. How do you measure both macro and micro? Now, let me take Delhi Policy Group, for example. Excellent presentation by Brigadier Arun Singh. Arun Sehgal. Now, why do you think that the discourse that you are having at the level of the capital with the policymakers, very successful discourse, very successful engagement, why do you think somebody in Salem or Bhilwara or Trivandrum would not be interested in that? They have an opinion, and in the sense that you have to go back and at least talk to them. Secondly, a message which is important, which is what you have spoken about, is to convey to all our youngsters that what is printed is not always right. This is a lesson that I learned in my childhood. Therefore, you do not go by what have you, and you can't depend upon doing good research through internet surveys. I gave you the example of labor reforms. It's become a mantra with various economists. And people, rattle off it as like a parrot without understanding as to what labor reforms mean, what is it that is required to be done, and whether it is necessary, what kind of reforms to be done. Fine, we have 44 pieces of labor legislation in place, and now the government is trying to bring it through 4 codes, but that is understandable. At the moment, but at the same time, not to follow a mantra just because so many people have said it. You have to find out for yourself. This is what an empirical research can help. Second is about this watchdog issue that you spoke about. A lot of people in the media depend on us for facts. And therefore, we work in sort of partnership with the media in order to get our views across the policymakers. This is another very good way as to how to get the policymakers' attention. Maybe 300-word story or 500-word story and not more than that. And journalists rely on you, again, on the basis of the work that you have done and so on. And that is, again, in a sense, a watchdog role which you play. Brevity is the enemy of good sense. I mean, there was a colleague from Sri Lanka and a colleague here rightly pointed out that you cannot practice brevity when you're going to turn out or put out research papers. Right. What we do is intentionally we write a 2-page policy brief from a 30-page research report. If you want a busy policymaker to read it, you can't expect him to read 30 pages or even the executive summary. The executive summary is usually the 2-page policy brief. So, back to back, if you can get the attention, or 800 words or what have you. And I dare say that we often found our messages getting across quite well, which is often referred to in many places. Quantification of data is extremely important, particularly qualitative data. See, if you have numbers, that is fine, but when you're dealing with qualitative data, how do you quantify it? We normally do it through an interview base or through focus group discussions, and then you try to infer things in the best manner possible, and that has to be, I agree, that has to be done in many research projects. That's very critical that we have to do. Thank you.
When you do research, or the branding is very important. And I'll give you an example. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. There is a brand value which the Chinese have attached to it. And until unless you do not create a brand value to what you are trying to do, what is it it's addressing? What is it that you are trying to achieve? You will not be able to catch the attention. So the whole idea is your research must catch the attention of the people whom you are addressing to. The second issue, the lady there talked about the pre-ideological positioning. See, ma'am, let me answer your question this way. He has his ideas about the Dalits. He has it, but ask him to put it down as a part of an empirical research, collect data, and tell you that is that data that he's collecting based on empirical research, does it match his preconceived perceptions? Until unless you make him do that, you will not be able to come to a conclusion. We need to be, and I give you a small interesting example. AMTI is a tool for looking at maritime movements in Indo-Pacific. Now AMTI what is it doing? It is simply using satellite data to look at critical movements in the Indo-Pacific. And everybody goes and looks at the AMTI movement. And please believe me, we all quote AMTI outputs without an iota of an idea whether if that guy makes a mistake, everybody one of us will be making a mistake. So we have to have, and we have the means. I can tell you 10 sites where you can look at movement. A satellite launch takes place anywhere in South Asia. We have a NOTAM. How many of us looks at NOTAMs? How many research institutions actually look at NOTAMs? How many of us look at what are the movements taking place around? Now we have an Iran crisis on our hands. How many people are actually looking at what is happening inside the whole system and what are the players doing? We are not looking at it, sirs. We are simply quoting from one newspaper to the other, which was somebody internet report, some Twitter report, etc., making a nice article, putting it in Financial Express, who picks up anything you send, and that's the story that comes out. And everybody then gets carried away. So we have to be, what I'm simply pointing to say is, we have to do hard research, look into the specifics, try and formulate an opinion only after you are convinced that you have got all the elements in place. And let your data support what your perceptions are and not your perception support the data, the other way around.
I don't have a question, but I would like a clarification. The word communication has been used since morning. Even in the keynote address, the word communication was used. So I would like to understand, what does it mean? Is it a one-way communication, or is it because what I understand of communication, it always needs to be a two-way communication, because one way is, pushing it down your throat. So when we talk of data, or we talk of any analysis or any recommendations, how do we understand the word communication?
So, just adding to this debate about bringing in who will be the new recruits to the think tanks in India. I think at Gateway House and some of the other think tanks that operating in India, the thing that we are trying to do is to bring in domain expertise to the subjects that we are studying. So we have a space scientist who is working on the space issues. We have someone who is studying the energy markets, and he's writing on the energy security. I probably would be a generalist in that sense, but at least I've worked on the counterterrorism issues within the government, so therefore I write on those subjects. I think that is the key. And that is intricately linked to the issue that we have been discussing about the funding. Unless you create viable career opportunities for these domain experts in the think tank industry, you'll not be able to get these people and therefore enhance the quality of the analysis in this field. Second issue about the track 1.5. I think, again, at Gateway House, what we have tried to do on the track 1.5 is going beyond, because most of the track 1.5 dialogues serve as talk shops. But what we have done here is actually write papers on some of the predetermined subjects and then discuss them as policy options for the both governments to take them forward. And then we have the officials from both the governments discussing and then saying, okay, maybe this policy is not workable, this option looks interesting, that way. So at least presenting these viable policy options to the policymakers is one way to take the track 1.5 forward.
So today, for example, I think one of the questions that need to be explored is, what's the role of think tank? In the sense that today itself, we heard that think tanks are basically revolving door through with the government. That's the platform. And then, but at the same time, in another panel, we heard that no, think tanks are a watchdog to government, and that's how that's what their role should be is. And then we are hearing that think tanks too often do agenda-driven research, or so I think these questions, if need to be answered, is something because I, for one, I don't like going to academic conferences because they're so niche and their languages are so boring and they've alienated the masses so much. No, the languages are really, I'm sure all of you have attended it. And I'm afraid, because I come from think tank background, think tanks will become the same. And in that case, they'll be pretty irrelevant. And another point I wanted to make, it seems like there is a problem with think tanks that the think tanks are having is the youth. The youth, we don't understand them. Communication may be the problem, but they don't understand research, the point of research. I think maybe that's another fundamental thing that needs to be addressed. Is it the communication? It might very well be the communication, or are the think tanks don't have enough youth blood in it? Just like gender issue, youth issue is also an issue. Is it well represented or not? I think with the gentleman here, I think what he was saying, that the communication is important, that you have to do it all three tiers, social media and old media and research publications. Things like that may be important. For example, one thing is very popular among youth in policy-related way of communicating is graphic novels. They just love it. I think in India, Quint, they do a good job in it. Things like that, and they do collaboration with one of the think tanks, if I'm not mistaken. So the point is, these are the issues I think think tanks need to address and communicate.
Sorry, I didn't want to make a very long point at all, but going back to the comments earlier about people assessing information, this is sort of critical thinking 101 stuff. This is philosophy. This goes right back to the basis of Western knowledge, how we know about the world around us. So I think encouraging young people to engage more in that process throughout most of us here probably do come into contact with students throughout their university career. I think that's really critical. But anyway, don't underestimate young people. I'm 34 and work in a think tank in a senior role. And I think that underestimating how young people we can see these movements of young people all around the world when it comes to different issues that they care about. So I think we shouldn't underestimate them either, to engage in what think tanks are doing. And perhaps it goes to the point about communication. How are we communicating with these people? We have a comms team, so we're very lucky to be able to, to be resourced to be able to do that. But don't underestimate young people in terms of engaging with what it is that we do.
One of the methods of communications that we use at a think tank, as a security think tank, with a wider audience is with the University of Colombo. So what we do is we bring in a batch of students, we absorb them as interns, and we now sort of formalize it that we mark it's part of their curriculum also, that you do a sort of internship, and if you're interested in international security, on the security domain. So in that way, we managed to sort of spread the message across to many students and also to a wider community. In the government also, we have a difficulty of communicating what a think tank is, actually. And it was after the Easter Sunday bombing that the security think tank came up as a top priority, and many started inquiring. So there are moments that think tanks are not so important, and there are moments that think tanks are really important. Thank you.
No, I think this point has been made that research has to be the mainstay, let's say, of these think tanks. And I think later point was empirical research. But from where will it come? And we find that most of the think tanks, they don't have a database on which they have been specializing for 10, 15, or 20 years. It's very important because the data that comes from the government has its own purpose. And I have very solid proof to do that. They keep on changing. They do, different kind of calculations, computations, the base year. Now in that I think, if think tanks have their own database, I am very sure that not only the government, but many organizations from India and elsewhere will look up to them, because it's only they who can give that, give the data, can give the analysis, can also make suggestions. That's one. Number two is that, we have been doing research, but what kind of research we have been doing? We have been doing research which is, I think, already, enough research. It is enough researched. That's one. Are we doing some research which can keep us ahead of the curve? So you have been talking of something which I think, is in everybody's eye, and people have been making comments here and there. And we say that we can give policy advice. What kind of policy advice you can give? If you have been talking of something which people know, I think, can you tell, I don't say that you should be an astrologer, but can you tell people the kind of thing, based on your own analysis, kind of thing, that are going to be there. Now, third thing which is important is that we should have a focus of short term and long term. In short term, yes, it may be problem solving, and only problem solving will give money. If we are not able to do problem solving for the industry, for I think any component of society, I don't think we can survive, because the more you depend on the government grant, I think you'll become oxymorons, if not now, I think, after a couple of days. Therefore, you have to be on your own. But if you have to be on your own, then I think you have to create a demand. You'll create the demand from supply side based on your database, on demand side because somebody wants it to be there. But based on that, I think when you have enough money, I am sure that you then talk of policy and people will come to you and they will hear you. But if you don't have money, I think, then I don't think anybody will like to come, because primarily they will believe that you have interest in money, but not, I think, in helping them. Therefore, I think we have to do something about databases. And I have seen, I'll just take half a minute, I have seen the most successful economists are those. The most successful economists are those who have created their own databases. They are not the databases, which have been nurtured by any government or by any global organization.
Thank you very much, Harsh. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shada Islam from Friends of Europe. It's a leading pan-European think tank based in Brussels. I'm Director for Europe and Geopolitics, and I'm really sorry to have missed the morning's session. I had logistical problems getting to Delhi. I was delayed. I found this conversation absolutely brilliant, very, very thoughtful. And I won't go into any details now because a lot of the challenges you've spoken about, a lot of the opportunities you've spoken about, everyone are very similar to what we face also in Europe. I want to ask Neelam a question, actually, because Jim's kicked off this session by highlighting the need for women and diversity in think tanks, and I couldn't agree more. I'm a woman, and I'm from a diverse background at a very leading European think tank, so I know exactly, Jim, what you mean. My question to you, Neelam, is that Gateway House, as you said, was set up by 2 women. Has that actually made an impact in terms of the kind of work you're doing, the content and the substance of what you're doing, and the attraction or the attention you get in this very crowded landscape as a women-led think tank? Thank you.
Any final comments, questions, observations on this topic? Because this will be the closing for this panel. Okay, I just wanted to make one brief point. I mean, there was this conversation about think tanks and research. I think one of the problems, or one of the aspects of this discussion which we should be aware of, and in particular in India, I think, is that think tanks don't exist in a vacuum. We get researchers from the kind of education system that we have. So ultimately, it's the question of, are we training our students right in our universities? If we are not, then think tanks really can't do much. I mean, you can embellish researchers that come to your institution, you can give them basic methodological training, but if the very idea of research is not being taught to them in universities, the sense of inquiry, so the question that was raised, what is the purpose of learning? And I think those are some of the fundamental questions that, at least in India, I think, and I'm an educationist, so I feel very passionate about that we have to ask those fundamental questions, because think tanks are not going to give those answers. I mean, a think tank that works on education perhaps will come with its own set of recommendations. But as think tankers who work in different aspects of public policy, we are not here to provide answers to these fundamental questions of almost a sense of national identity, that we know what is it that the purpose of education is. And ultimately, a lot of what we want to do, what we should do, or what we will try to do will depend on our education system. So ultimately, unless we have students, unless we have researchers who are shaped by that sense, that purpose of inquiry, we will always struggle with this question. I'm sure the same is in Bangladesh. I'm sure there are problems in other South Asian countries, and I'm sure there are problems in other areas. I mean, I teach in London. I know that London think tankers also tell me that there is a problem because you have retention problem, you have, where are the opportunities, why would students come to think tanks, and so on and so forth. So I think the ecosystem, by and large, would shape a think tank's ability to maneuver on this issue. But Neelam, I think maybe you want to respond to it.
Yeah, just very briefly, no, Shada, being a woman set up think tank, I don't think has influenced the choice of areas of research. We are quite small, and I think the areas of research have actually been determined more by who comes and by the researcher we can get, rather than being able to set some kind of agenda in advance. I have one more comment, if I may make, quite separately on the question of, who comes as an intern, who joins as a researcher, etc. Our experience in Mumbai is that the universities there, at least in Mumbai, have not had very good master's programs in international relations, leaving aside altogether the quality case, which is very important and something that Harsh has just spoken about. So the interns that we get and some of the research associates that we get come to us with master's degrees from, the London School of Economics or, the Fletcher School, some very good places, I'm sure, but they do come with a perspective. And that perspective is reinforced by the fact that we work in the English language, that a lot of the sources of understanding and reading and daily news stuff is all in English. So actually, I think there is a real problem of perspective for all of us. And I don't know how we should be trying to address that. The only way we do it, and maybe that's the one thing that as a woman, I am constantly hectoring the people who work with us in Gateway House and saying, I know where you picked that up from. That's not the way to look at it. But this is not a solution. This is not a solution.
This was a point Arun also made earlier about sourcing. And I think, you always hear this complaint that where is original thinking coming from from the South? But this is exactly the reasons why it is not happening, because we are almost copying our friends in Brussels, in London, in Washington. That's what they're, so there is, if you read the stuff, it's very similar, because the ideas, what we expect, for example, for someone sitting in India, there are less and less ideas, for example, which you can say are being sourced out of some, what is happening in Marathwada in Maharashtra. So that's how you generate the source, but that's not happening. You are still reading New York Times and getting your information about what is happening in Mumbai.
Well,
So
I'm not, it's too expensive. No, only because it's too expensive.
Yes. I mean, there are very, very serious issues there.
No, see, we need to, apart from English language, we need to, this is my firm conviction that we need to develop language training, and through that, if we were to move in that direction, we would be able to pick up much more diverse sources of information that would be very useful to us. And this is very important, because you see what is happening is there is a huge area of information base that is simply not available to us. And most of the countries, Southeast Asia, for example, even China, in Myanmar, they are mostly writing in their own language. When we have to pick up those information. Second thing is, people are saying, how do I do my analytical judgment? The analytical judgment has to be made based on how are you looking at developments. And you cannot look at developments on simply somebody says, write an article on this. No, sir. You have to have your researchers working in particular areas where he is forced to develop his own database. He develops his critical database. He works on that database, and you can supplement it subsequently by other sources. But he has to have his database. There is no alternative to having your own database. We all have our own database. And you cannot simply turn around and say that, for example, we were discussing the North Korean nuclear doctrine, for example. I was discussing. Now, when you read from the Western press the thought process on the North Korean nuclear doctrine, there is an perspective. When I was talking to my Japanese colleagues, it was entirely a different perspective. Now, he's looking at it from a different perspective, primarily why, sir? He's looking at it because Japan is under nuclear threat from North Korea. So he's looking at it from a very, very different perspective. You ask a South Korean and he'll give you a very, very different perspective. So what I'm trying to simply, just highlighting this point, I don't want to labor on it, but this is an important issue. On the issue of communication, you're absolutely right, ma'am. It has to be two ways. There cannot be a one-way communication. They must be able to challenge what has been put across, and you should be able to challenge it. And this is again an area where we have to make our research community not accept whatever is given to them by so-called senior people and say, okay, you accept this. No. There must be spirit of inquiry, spirit of challenge, and then only if you are convinced, then only you accept it. Because until and unless you do that, then you will simply write somebody else's thoughts in your papers, which is not what is required to be done. Thank you.
No, sir, my point is different. As researchers, as think tank forums, we send out certain policy recommendations based on the research, whether first-hand research or secondary research. So, how do we get the feedback from the audience at which it is targeted? That is my question.
So if you're looking at the government, you will not get a direct
Government,
feedback.
you will draw.
No, you will get a feedback. I'll tell you how interesting feedbacks you get. You get a feedback in conversations. You will not get, nobody will send you back a letter to say, I accept A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I don't respect. As far as other advocacy issues are concerned, is when you find, and at least that's my personal view is, when you find some of your conclusions being quoted by others. Yeah, people do pick up conclusions. I mean, they either quote you directly or they pick up the sense of what your questions are and you will get to know the idea. But by and large, that's how it will happen. You will never get a certification from anybody that I like that idea, but we are very bad at giving compliments anyway.
Has social media made it easier, this two-way communication?
So, no, yes, it has. Actually, we try and track responses to our weekly websites.
Thanks. Let me pick up the last conversation on communication. I think you have made a very important point. Quite often, many of the regulators invite, put out consultation papers and invite comments, and that's the end of it. You send your comment, you don't know what has happened to it. Some change has been taking place where the comments are then open to public on the website. Say, I'm giving an example of Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. There's been a slight change, but at the end of the day, we don't know as to, and that, as Brigadier Sehgal said, would be reflected in the kind of conversation that you hear, or in the kind of policy changes which will happen.
Eventually see.
But there again, the important thing, what I have said and what has been said by many, is that your recommendations have to be evidence-based. They cannot be out of the head or out of sort of hearsay or rhetoric. That one has to be very careful about, otherwise your credibility gets lost. Now, somebody mentioned domain expertise. I think that's, yes, that is important. And that, Harsh, going to your point about one of the challenges that we have, and this is something which is to be noted in this event, is retention. Retention is a big challenge that we find of good, smart youngsters. We attract them, fortunately, by being more of a kind of an NGO that, look, we are here to make the world a better place to live in. So we are sending a message across that we are not developing something cold out of nothing. And that way we work upon the EQ rather than the IQ. You have to work upon a combination of IQ and EQ, emotional quotient. Otherwise you don't get the kind of output that is required. This is our own experience. And we've had people who lived on, two of our centers are headed by women, by the way. So it's not as if, and now, agenda-driven research was a point which is made. Of course, research is often agenda-driven. But how do you do the research? Is it independent or not? You can't you can't do research in isolation or in vacuum. There has to be an agenda. But the point which was made is that you do not go on there was a lady who was here who was left, a preconceived hypothesis that, this is how it is. It is not, as I gave you the example of our own finding on many issues. Now, we have a demographic dividend in India in the sense that we are one of the youngest countries in the world, about 75% people who are below the age of 35, of which about 60% are in the age group of 25 to 28. But are they going in the right direction? That is the other problem. Somebody said that the demographic dividend may turn out to be a demographic disaster. Yeah. That's a big challenge for India as such. And this is what think tanks must understand as to how they can do that. And this is something which guides our work very clearly, that how is it that we can engage more youth into, including employment. One of the problems that we've seen often, in terms of employment, a young man coming out of a farmer's family doesn't want to go to farming. A young man belonging to a cobbler's family will not do cobbling. they all want a government job, or they all want, some more fancy job instead to go back to their traditional farming. It's a big problem in India, let me tell you that. Education is creating this kind of problem, because in any case, they are not getting vocational education. And we've got a huge skill building exercise, but we are not teaching them the value of dignity of labor, for example. That they are not able to comprehend. This is why should I be doing, what my ancestors have been doing? I can do something else. And that's, for think tanks in India, that's a big challenge which I would like to speak about. Now, the issue about government data, indeed government data. Now, for example, we do a lot of work, economic research, we rely upon CMIE data, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which is a very reliable source. So it is not, we do cross-check with the government data which is there, but you rely upon data which is there. And then when you find there is suspect data, then you replace it with other proxies in your research. You don't rely upon the data or don't come to any conclusion with a particular data set which you think is suspect. And as I said, you can do it, you can do qualitative surveys also through interviews, etc., etc. An important point was made here in terms of the research outputs, both short-term and long-term. And the long-term, we are all dead, as they say. So one has to be careful that, what is it that you could do in order to address a particular problem, a solution in terms of short-term or long-term or even medium-term. That is, again, very important. Let me end here, Harsh.
Thank you, and I think I will close this session now, because we also have to move from here to the Taj, and we have a few final sort of comments to make about the larger outcome of this forum. But I think, as you all as we were all discussing, there are a number of issues on the table which perhaps in this rapidly changing environment for think tanks, we all will have to grapple with, I think, with great rapidity, because I don't think we have the luxury of responding at our own pace. But I think the wider point as far as India is concerned, that we really have to look at how we are educating our youth, and therefore in terms of the research, in terms of how we are communicating that research to a wider audience, and how we bring, I think, stakeholders from outside. And so it has been, it's been wonderful to see more think tanks coming from outside Delhi to this forum over the years, because that's one of the ways in which we want, hopefully, the discourse to move out of Delhi bubble, which is going to be one of the most important tasks, perhaps, for the think tanking community in India over the next few years. Thank you. Jim, over to you.
It's always a long march in terms of trying to jam a lot of sessions and information into a very compact span of time, which makes this grueling, and we're at the end of it. But over the years, it's both rewarding in terms of the number of institutions that come out and the diversity, which in terms of the last discussion, a few sort of caveats or observations. One is that there isn't a single think tank in terms of, or think tank model. There are think tanks that are traditional and traditionally focused on the academic model. There are what are described as think and do tanks. They're strictly do tanks that don't do a lot of thinking and push the ideas of others. They're talk tanks, and now they're virtual tanks. In terms of journalism, the reality is it's a result of a supply and demand. There are so many out-of-work, high-quality journalists that are increasingly employed by think tanks. Last year's North America Think Tank Summit, 30%, when we did what was your previous profession, 30% were former journalists. And that, the two dimensions of that are, one, there's a demand for more journalistic, accessible information coming from think tanks, and journalists are trained to do that. And so it is both a supply and a demand on the demand side from think tanks. Strategic communications, I think, in terms of what we have talked about, is sort of key. I mean, there is a whole rethink about when and where you start communicating research. The traditional sense was that once it's produced, you start to think about where you're going to send it. That is now turned on its head, that where you're sending it, what is the audience, should be identified at the very outset, not to determine the results, but to begin to think about who are the stakeholders who would be interested in what is produced. Being a professor for now 30 years, having taught and created a research methods course, and speaking to my colleagues, and I have 75 research interns every semester. The reality is that students, both graduate students that I advise on their thesis, have no time for literature reviews or data. That is a simple fact. And in terms of our industry, the reality is that we're going to have to retrain. I force my interns to collect data and see that there is power in data, but they hate it. They absolutely hate collecting data. My graduate students have no concept of that if you're doing a comparative study, you should compare apples to apples, not apples, oranges, tangerines, avocados, the whole works. And they still do it. And so that there is a tremendous atrophy which impacts greatly our industry. The reality is that they are getting information in totally different ways than we have seen, and the rethink in terms of track and tenure is reflected in that. And so these are things that, some of which are in our control, a lot is not in our control. The reality is, in terms of major think tanks and in terms of journalists, for instance, the Peterson Institute hired not out of work, but a journalist from the New York Times who essentially has transformed how they communicate all of their reports with tremendous effect, positive effect. Brookings has required every single junior and senior researcher to have a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page, and to how to use it and how to put their research on that. It has dramatically, which is sort of transformed in both places. Economists now see the value of their research being published more widely because of the hiring of a journalist who has trained them. A lot of blood on the floor, not easy. And at Brookings, dramatic uptake in their research as a result of that. So there is, and I think the reality is that research is important, will continue to be the central mission of think tanks, but the reality is communications is equally important, and many across the world, north, south, east, and west, are directing their budgets or reshaping their budgets relative to a focus on research, but also on communications and dissemination. This is, I think, an important gathering. Hopefully it will continue well into the future. The question, and I think your response to this sort of question of what are the things that might work on in the future is incredibly rich. We will essentially have that typed up and sorted. There is a clustering in terms of the responses. I went through them very quickly. One, which was very clear, and a theme here, is on youth. Several people mentioned that. Technology, communications, the issues around research. This, division between, are we dumbing things down? Are we losing the sort of value of data and research is an ongoing discussion, and the blurring is there. The quality and the dependability of all institutions are dependent on how good, how innovative is their last idea. And I always say that think tanks are only good as their last good idea. And then, you start over. But this has been a tremendous discussion, and hopefully a lot of this will serve as a catalyst for individual institution, scholars and institutional collaboration. There's one quick intervention.
James, if I can share a snippet that connects to what you're saying and may help people here on communication. At Verite Research, we remind people, and we have this mantra, we say, if you're an academic, the most insulting thing you can say about a piece of writing is it's journalistic. Now, if you're a journalist, the most insulting thing you can say about a piece of writing is it's academic. And we tell our researchers, write in a way that neither party can make that criticism about you. Journalists can't say it's academic, academics can't say it's journalistic. So you have to have rigor and be engaging at the same time. And that is just 101 training for our researchers, right? We have courses on writing, we work with them and say we are living in a different world. So just
I would be remiss if I did not recognize Harsh and ORF's contribution and their very able staff who have been with us through thick and thin, in the back, outside, guiding us through this process. And I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to you for all of your efforts in helping make both financially and organizationally this meeting possible.
Thank you, Jim, and I hope we'll continue this conversation next year when we meet again in 2021, around 2021 Raisina. But I hope you had a productive day. It was a long day, and there is another session waiting for us at the Taj. But I hope that the networking opportunities and the discussion about various issues on the agenda today would hopefully generate some conversations amongst ourselves, and hopefully we can take something out of here which will allow us to engage more over the course of this year and come back next year and deliberate whether all of this was very useful, or we are squaring the circle once again when we meet next year. So with that, thank you so much. And I would like to, in particular, thank my team here, Shubhangi, Anurag, Priyal, all of them. I'm sure you have been interacting with them over the last few weeks. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Jim. Hopefully we'll once again meet next year. And thank you all.
God will.